It's one thing to be betrayed, it's another to know you're being betrayed and have to lie perfectly still while it happens. This is the story of a man who pretended to be unconscious to expose the people who wanted him gone. And what he uncovered wasn't just an attempted betrayal of his wealth, but a total dissection of trust, family, and power. This isn't the story of a man losing everything. It's the story of how he took everything back without saying a single word until it mattered most. Julian Blackwell was the heir to one of the largest privately owned hotel chains on the East Coast, a man who, despite his success, was rarely seen in tabloids, rarely flaunted his money, and rarely trusted anyone. He was a quiet type, the kind who wore tailored suits but preferred working behind the scenes, known to be fair, but unshakably private. So when news broke that Julian had been in a devastating car accident and had fallen into a coma, the public reaction was subdued, curious but respectful. But inside the hospital room where Julian lay motionless, something much darker was taking root because Julian wasn't in a coma at all. He was fully conscious, fully aware, and fully watching as the people closest to him circled like vultures. His cousin Damien and his stepmother Catherine wasted no time once he was deemed incapacitated. They began filing emergency petitions for power of attorney, altering the flow of assets, manipulating staff, and even ordering medications that would render him truly unconscious. Their plan was clear: keep him asleep long enough to legally bleed him dry and claim his empire. And this is where we need to pause, because this type of story isn't pure fiction. There have been real cases of medical and financial abuse, particularly involving wealthy elders or incapacitated patients, where family members abuse guardianship laws to siphon assets or force power transfers. And Julian, who had long suspected that his inner circle might not be loyal, had already begun laying the groundwork for protection years ago, including hidden recordings, redundant legal barriers, and most importantly, one loyal attorney who knew better than to trust a phone call. Now enter Nora Ellis, a nurse who didn't fit the mold of passive background caretaker. She was sharp, observant, and from the beginning suspicious of the odd. Instructions surrounding Julian's case, she noticed changes to medication orders that didn't align with his vitals and subtle tension among staff. But what truly disturbed her was how clinical everyone had become, treating him like furniture instead of a man. And Nora, perhaps because of her own history with family betrayal, decided to document everything just in case. And here's where the story starts to pivot, because when Nora began speaking to Julian, privately assuming he couldn't hear, she didn't talk like a nurse. She talked like a human. She told him she was scared. She told him that the people in his life gave her a bad feeling. And she told him that even if he couldn't hear her, she wasn't going to let anything happen to him. And Julian, though unable to move or speak, felt something he hadn't in weeks. He felt hope. If you've ever been in a situation where you couldn't act, couldn't defend yourself, couldn't scream for help, but someone chose to protect you anyway, then you understand the power of what Nora did. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to start pulling Julian back from the edge. And over the next few days, as Nora continued to speak to him, run gentle tests, document discrepancies, and question protocol, Julian began to respond subtly, blinking fingers, twitching the smallest signs. And Nora noticed, and rather than reporting it, she leaned in and created a communication system: one blink for yes, two for no. And through that primitive code, Julian began to tell her everything, not in detail, but enough to confirm what she feared. And this kind of patient-nurse dynamic is rare, but not unheard of in real life. For example, in 2003, a nurse in Michigan discovered, through subtle signals, that a supposedly vegetative patient was fully aware. And her persistence not only saved the man's life, but exposed critical flaws in the diagnosis process. Nora was becoming that kind of advocate. And Julian, despite his immense wealth, was completely dependent on her. The irony, of course, being that the man with everything had only one real ally, and she had no idea how much he had until the day she overheard a conversation outside the room. Damien and Catherine arguing about timing, about needing the medical records, suppressed about slipping something into the IV, and when Nora wrote everything down and brought it to her private journal, she also dropped a line to a contact she hadn't spoken to in years. Avery Blake, the attorney Julian had entrusted long ago. And this is where the pieces start to move. And in the next section, we'll explore how Julian and Nora began plotting quietly through nothing but eye blinks and whispered observations to flip the entire conspiracy upside down. There's a point in every conspiracy where silence becomes riskier than exposure. And for Julian and Nora, that moment came not with a dramatic outburst or secret being leaked, but through the quiet confirmation that they were being watched, that whatever plan Damien and Catherine were brewing was about to move into its final phase. Nora had already made peace with the fact that she was putting her job on the line. She had started using her off hours to copy medical records, burn private audio files, and document every word she heard around Julian's room while pretending to be just another tired, overworked nurse. And Julian every day sharpened his responses from eye blinks to small finger gestures to slight eye movements. They developed a full communication code, not elaborate but effective. And through that system, Julian told her everything he could, who to trust, who to avoid, what kind of evidence might be hidden in his estate, and what worries kept him awake behind that unmoving face. And this is the part that many people overlook when thinking about stories like this, that beneath the thriller setup, there's a real emotional weight, because Julian was not just trying to survive, he was emotionally unraveling while forced to lie motionless and trust a stranger with everything: his name, his legacy, his life. And Nora was quietly reshaping everything she believed about her job. She had entered nursing for the usual reasons: to help, to serve, to heal. But this wasn't a job anymore. It was a rescue mission. And the more she peeled back the layers of Julian's medical case, the more she realized how deep the manipulation went. Records that didn't match prescriptions, verbal orders that were undocumented, nurses being rotated without notice, and even camera blind spots in critical areas of the floor. It was all too calculated, and so she began using a small wearable camera hidden in her badge, the kind used in undercover investigations. And with that, she captured the first real piece of evidence. Damien speaking to a hospital administrator off the record about how long it would take to legally justify ending care, and Catherine pushing for "do not resuscitate" paperwork that Julian had never signed. And these moments were chilling, not because they were loud, but because of how casual they were. And if you followed any high-profile legal guardianship abuse cases, you know how disturbingly real this is, like the case of Britney Spears, which, although different in circumstance, similarly showed how wealth, fame, and control can become cages if the wrong people are empowered. Nora, realizing she now had more than suspicion but proof, called Avery Blake, the attorney Julian had trusted, and through a secure app, she sent snippets of footage, hidden logs, and finally the video that made Avery pause: a grainy clip of Damien in Julian's hospital room, checking the IV bag, saying this will keep him out of the picture, and laughing. Nora's hands shook as she hit send, and Julian blinked once for yes when she asked him, "Are you sure this is what you want?" Because this would trigger the chain. And that chain began quietly, with Avery contacting a judge under emergency medical fraud statutes and arranging for a private investigator to be embedded within the hospital under the guise of a new tech consultant, while Nora began planting audio recorders in non-patient areas, lounges, and supply rooms. And each day she reported back to Julian, giving him updates, watching his eyes shift with every new piece of intel. And this odd bond between them, a man pretending to be a patient and a nurse, pretending not to know, became the safest space either of them had ever known. And Nora even confessed one night that she had once almost left nursing after a whistleblowing case went wrong, and no one believed her. Julian blinked twice the first time for no, the second to say thank you. And if you think that kind of communication is too simple to matter, think again, because studies have shown that in cases of locked-in syndrome, patients have reported feeling profound emotional comfort from even the smallest acknowledgments of agency. And Julian had that now: not freedom, but a plan. And with the help of the PI, they discovered even more: that Catherine had been using shell corporations to move Julian's funds, that Damien had paid off 2 board members to approve a leadership transfer in case of death, and that a fake signature had been forged on estate documents 2 days after Julian's accident. And these weren't just betrayals, they were crimes, and yet still Julian waited. He didn't want to burst out of bed and call a press conference. He wanted them caught in the act, exposed in a way that would leave no room for legal maneuvering. And in the next part, we'll see how Nora, Julian, and Avery prepare for the final confrontation, setting up the trap, and watching as the people who thought they held all the power walk straight into it. Every good trap relies on one thing: timing, And when the people setting it are arrogant enough to believe no one's watching, they often make the most noise in the silence. And for Julian and Nora, that silence was finally over, because every piece of the puzzle had been collected. Every tape, every document, every signature comparison, every coded conversation. And now all that remained was to put the plan in motion. And it started like this. Julian's attorney, Avery Blake, scheduled a board meeting at the Blackwell Group headquarters, claiming he had urgent legal updates regarding the future of the company, and Catherine and Damien showed up dressed for victory, ready to finalize the transfer of power, with documents in hand. But the moment they stepped into the glass conference room and saw the judge seated at the far end of the table, flanked by two legal clerks, something in their expressions flickered, and in that moment on the other side of the building, inside a black SUV parked behind the freight entrance, Julian sat with Nora beside him, his suit pressed, his eyes calm, no longer pretending to sleep, and he said quietly one last time, "Are we sure?" And Nora replied, "Yes, they're all inside, and the recording is ready. And if you've ever had a moment where justice was finally catching up to those who hurt you, you know that the adrenaline isn't rage, it's cold, it's focused." And Julian stepped out, walked across the lot through the service elevator, and into the room just as Catherine stood to begin her presentation. And when she turned and saw him, her mouth opened, but no sound came. And Damien dropped his pen and said nothing. Because the man they had just declared medically unfit to lead was now walking into the room without assistance, standing upright, looking directly at them. And without raising his voice, Julian sat at the head of the table and said, "Before we begin, I'd like to play a recording." And with that, Avery queued up the video footage from the hospital, Damien's voice filling the speakers as he said this will keep him out of the picture, followed by Catherine's forged DNR orders and several other clips showing forged discussions, unauthorized banking access, and falsified health documentation. And the room was frozen except for the sound of every lie unraveling. And when the video ended, Julian stood and said, "I may have been quiet, but I was never gone." And the judge looked at Catherine and Damien and simply said, "You're both under investigation." And moments later, two state investigators entered the room and escorted them out. And that should have been the end. But it wasn't because Julian didn't want just exposure, he wanted prevention. And so in the days that followed, he worked with Nora and Avery to file formal charges of medical fraud, attempted estate theft, and conspiracy to manipulate legal guardianship. And the state took it seriously, and Nora testified to everything, providing dates, transcripts, and her own recordings. And the hospital launched a full internal audit, uncovering multiple irregularities, not just in Julian's case, and several administrators were suspended. Catherine and Damien were charged and eventually convicted, not just because of what they did, but because someone cared enough to watch. And this part of the story is so important, because in the real world, whistleblowers like Nora often face retaliation, job loss, legal threats, and yet her courage changed everything. Not just for Julian, but for anyone in that hospital who might have been silenced. And Julian, who had once controlled empires from behind the curtain, now chose to step forward and tell his story, not in a media frenzy, but in a quiet press conference where he thanked one nurse for believing in dignity, for seeing humanity where others saw a business opportunity. And this mirrors stories like that of Dr. Michael Swango or Charles Cullen, where whistleblowers tried to raise the alarm in flawed systems and were ignored for too long. But when they were finally heard, lives were saved. And that's the difference one voice can make. And Julian's voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, and after the press conference, he went back to the hospital. Not as a patient, but as a guest. He walked into the break room where Nora sat drinking coffee and said, "There's something I've wanted to ask." And she raised an eyebrow and said, "If you ask me to be your nurse again, I'm going to slap you." And he smiled and said, "Not a nurse, maybe a partner." And she stared at him for a second and then nodded and said, "Okay, but I'm not changing your IVs anymore." And they both laughed because after all the surveillance, the betrayal, the silence, this moment felt like sunlight after years of winter. And in the next part, we'll see how they move forward together, building something that doesn't just heal Julian's wounds, but protects others from facing the same nightmare he did. After everything they had endured, Julian and Nora didn't want fame or revenge. They wanted purpose. And that purpose came quietly at first in the form of long conversations late into the night about what could have happened to Julian if Nora hadn't spoken up, and what might still be happening to others in places with no cameras and no witnesses. And it was in one of those conversations that Julian said, "What if we made sure this never happens again?" And Nora said, "Then we build something that outlives both of us." And so they started with a single room, a converted office in one of Julian's hotels that became a support center for patient advocates. And within a year, that room turned into a foundation, the Nora Ellis Foundation, dedicated to protecting the rights of medically vulnerable patients and supporting whistleblowers in healthcare systems. And while Julian provided the funding, Nora became the face, the speaker, the one who stood in front of rooms filled with lawmakers, administrators, and young nurses and said what they were all afraid to admit, that hospitals are businesses, and business is vulnerable to corruption when no one is watching, and people listened because her story was real. Not sensational, just steady and human, and over time they expanded, launching programs to train nurses on ethical reporting, creating anonymous hotlines, pairing legal teams with patient families, and even offering grants to hospitals that implemented transparency tech. And this work mattered because it wasn't just born from outrage, it was born from survival. And survival stories are the ones that change things the most, because they don't just expose problems, they offer proof that people can make it out and still choose grace. And Julian, meanwhile, returned to his company, not as the shadow leader he once was, but as a visible present CEO. He restructured the board, implemented a whistleblower clause across all departments, and made sure that no one person could ever consolidate unchecked control again. While the business side thrived, the personal side did too. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but it was built on the one thing that had saved them both: trust, the kind earned in silence and tested in pressure. And when they finally decided to marry, they didn't host a ballroom gala. They invited 20 people to the same rooftop where they had watched the city after it all ended, and they said their vows under string lights with a violinist in the corner. And Nora wore a simple white dress, and Julian cried through half the ceremony, and afterward they didn't jet off to a villa or post photos online. They went back to the Foundation Center and launched a pediatric unit because, as Nora said, children deserve to be protected by grown-ups who remember what it's like to feel powerless. And that moment captured everything. Not the money, not the victory, but the choice to turn pain into protection. And if that's not legacy, what is? And I want to share a real story here that echoes theirs, the case of a man named Alan from Boston who, after surviving misdiagnosis and cover-ups at his local VA hospital, used his settlement money to start a watchdog group that now operates in 10 states, or the nurse in Colorado who created a scholarship for student nurses who commit to transparency pledging to put people before policy. And these aren't headlines, they're choices just like Julian's and Nora's. And on the 5th anniversary of the foundation, they opened a new wing and invited every nurse who had ever called their hotline, every family they had helped, every survivor who had once thought they were alone. And Julian gave a speech that night and said, "We cannot always stop cruelty, but we can make sure it's not comfortable." And Nora added, "And we can make sure it's never quiet." And their story closed not with fireworks, but with lights across buildings that had once been cold, now glowing warm, with people who finally had someone on their side. And in the final shot, Nora stands at a classroom door, welcoming a new class of nurses, telling them that ethics is not an extra credit topic. It's the core of the work. And as the camera pulls back, we see a plaque on the wall engraved with the words, "Let no one suffer unheard." And if you take anything from this story, let it be that silence is not neutrality. It is consent, and that one voice, even one whispered in fear, can change the outcome for someone else. And if you ever find yourself in a room where the powerful assume you're asleep, where the dangerous believe no one is watching, remember this: you do not have to shout to be heard. You only have to care enough to act, because justice doesn't always arrive with sirens. Sometimes it walks in wearing scrubs, carrying a notebook, and asking questions that no one else will. And that is enough. That is everything.